This old 1904 family portrait seems happy, until you see what the youngest daughter is clutching. Dr. Rebecca Foster had worked at the Detroit Historical Museum for 15 years, cataloging thousands of photographs that documented the city's transformation from a modest trading post into an industrial powerhouse. On a gray November morning in 2018, she opened a cardboard box donated by the estate of a woman named Clara Jenkins, who had passed away at the age of 103. Inside were dozens of family photographs, letters, and personal documents spanning nearly a century of Detroit history. The photograph that caught Rebecca's attention was mounted on thick cardboard, its corners worn soft by time. The image showed a family of 5, standing on the front porch of a wooden house. The sepia tones had faded to a warm brown, but the details remained remarkably sharp. A photographer's stamp on the back read, "Morrison Photography Studio, Gratiot Avenue, Detroit, Michigan, October 1904. The family appeared prosperous by the standards of the era. The father wore a dark suit with a pressed white shirt, his posture straight and dignified. The mother sat in a wooden chair, her dress carefully arranged, a cameo brooch at her throat. 3 children stood between them, 2 boys who looked to be about 12 and 10, and a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. What made Rebecca pause was the girl's expression. While the rest of the family maintained the formal, slightly stiff poses typical of early 20th century photography, the youngest child had a look of fierce concentration on her small face. Her eyes were fixed on something just beyond the camera's view, and her tiny hands were pressed against her chest, clutching something that was partially obscured by the folds of her white dress. Rebecca pulled her magnifying glass closer, studying the girl's hands. Whatever she was holding was small, rectangular, and appeared to be made of paper or cardboard. The edge of it was just visible between her fingers, a corner of printed text that Rebecca couldn't quite make out. She logged the photograph into the museum's digital archive system and flagged it for high-resolution scanning. The Jenkins donation had come with a brief note explaining that these were the belongings of Clara's great-aunt, a woman named Ruth, who had lived in Detroit her entire life. There was no other context, no names attached to the people in the photographs, no explanation of their significance. Rebecca had learned over the years that the most important historical discoveries often looked unremarkable at first glance. A family portrait from 1904, seemingly ordinary and pleasant, might contain details that would only reveal their significance under closer examination. She had no way of knowing that this particular photograph would lead her to uncover one of the most dangerous and courageous acts of resistance in early 20th century Detroit, a secret hidden in plain sight for more than a century, clutched in a 6-year-old girl's hands. 2 weeks later, Rebecca received notification that the high-resolution scan was ready. The museum had recently invested in scanning equipment capable of capturing extraordinary detail, allowing researchers to examine photographs at magnifications impossible with traditional methods. She settled at her computer with a cup of coffee, expecting a routine cataloging session. She began systematically, zooming in on different sections of the image. The house behind the family showed careful maintenance. Fresh paint on the porch railings, clean windows, a small garden visible at the edge of the frame. The father's suit, though simple, was well-tailored and meticulously cared for. The mother's dress showed evidence of skilled handiwork with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Then, Rebecca zoomed in on the youngest girl's hands, and her breath caught in her throat. At maximum magnification, the object clutched against the child's chest became clear. It was a train ticket, but not just any ticket. The printed text was now legible. Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company. Special passage, one way, good for bearer and family. But what made Rebecca's hands tremble as she adjusted the image contrast was what she could see written in small, careful handwriting along the bottom edge of the ticket. Safe passage arranged. Present to Conductor Wilson. Destroy after use. This was no ordinary travel document. The phrasing, the handwritten instructions, the way the child held it as if her life depended on it, everything pointed to something far more significant than a simple family trip. Rebecca zoomed in further on the girl's face. The fierce concentration she had noticed before now made perfect sense. This child wasn't just posing for a photograph. She was guarding something precious, something dangerous, something that needed to be documented but also protected. Her small fingers gripped the ticket tightly enough that Rebecca could see the tension in her knuckles, even across more than a century of distance. The date on the ticket was partially visible. October 18th, 1904. The same month the photograph was taken. Rebecca cross-referenced this with her knowledge of Detroit history. In 1904, the city was experiencing rapid industrial growth, attracting workers from across the country. But it was also a destination for black families fleeing violence and oppression in the South, families who needed help, protection, and above all, secrecy. Rebecca printed several enlarged versions of the ticket, studying every visible detail. The more she examined it, the more convinced she became that this photograph documented something extraordinary. Evidence of an underground network still operating decades after the Civil War, still helping families escape to freedom, still risking everything to move people to safety. She needed to find out who this family was, where they had come from, and what had happened to the little girl who had been trusted with such an important secret. Rebecca began her search at the Detroit Public Library's Burton Historical Collection, which housed extensive records of the city's black community from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She started with city directories from 1904, cross-referencing addresses on Gratiot Avenue near the Morrison Photography Studio. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A librarian named Michael Chen, who had overheard Rebecca describing her search, brought her a collection of church records from Second Baptist Church, one of Detroit's oldest black congregations. If a black family was living in Detroit in 1904, Michael explained, there's a good chance they were connected to Second Baptist. The church was central to the community, especially for families newly arrived from the South. Rebecca carefully turned the pages of the membership ledger. In October 1904, a new family had been registered. Thomas and Catherine Price, along with their 3 children, William, James, and Ruth. The address listed was on Brush Street, just a few blocks from Gratiot Avenue. The registration noted that the family had recently arrived from Birmingham, Alabama. Ruth, the same name mentioned in the donation note. Rebecca's pulse quickened. She cross-referenced the name with the museum's donation records and found confirmation. Clara Jenkins had written that the photographs belonged to her great-aunt Ruth Price, who had been born in Birmingham in 1898 and had lived in Detroit until her death in 1982 at the age of 84. Rebecca now had a name and a timeline. Ruth Price, 6 years old in the photograph, clutching a ticket that promised safe passage for her family's escape from Alabama to Michigan. But the bigger questions remained, why did they need to escape? Who had arranged the passage, and why had they documented it in a photograph, risking exposure? She turned to historical records of Birmingham in 1904. What she found was chilling. The city was in the grip of violent racial oppression. Black residents faced constant threats, arbitrary arrests, and forced labor contracts that were slavery in everything but name. Lynchings were common, and families who spoke out or attempted to leave could face deadly consequences. A newspaper article from the Birmingham Age-Herald, dated September 1904, caught her attention. Negro carpenter arrested for breach of contract. Thomas Price detained pending investigation of unauthorized departure from employment. The article was brief, dismissive, but the name sent chills down Rebecca's spine. Thomas Price, Ruth's father. Rebecca knew she needed to travel to Birmingham to understand the full story. 3 weeks later, she arrived at the Birmingham Public Library's Archives Department, where a researcher named Dr. Marcus Williams had agreed to help her investigate the Price family's history in Alabama. Marcus had spent decades documenting the experiences of black families during the Jim Crow era, and he understood immediately the significance of what Rebecca had found. The year 1904 was particularly brutal in Birmingham, he explained, pulling out boxes of records and newspapers. The convict leasing system was at its peak. Black men were arrested on fabricated charges and then leased to mining companies, steel mills, and railroad construction crews. The mortality rate in those labor camps was devastating. Together, they pieced together Thomas Price's story. He had been a skilled carpenter, employed by a white-owned construction company. According to labor records Marcus had collected, Thomas had been promised wages of $1 per day, but had received only a fraction of that amount, paid irregularly and often in scrip rather than cash. When he had asked for the money owed to him, he had been arrested for a breach of contract, a charge commonly used to trap black workers in cycles of debt and forced labor. But Thomas had never made it to a labor camp. Court records showed that his case had been mysteriously dismissed after only 3 days in jail. No explanation was given, no fine was paid, and Thomas Price simply disappeared from Birmingham's official records after September 1904. He escaped, Marcus said quietly, looking at the documents spread across the table. Someone helped him get out before he could be sent to the camps, and his family went with him. Rebecca showed Marcus the high-resolution image of the ticket Ruth had been clutching. Marcus examined it carefully, then pulled out a leather-bound journal from one of his archive boxes. I've been collecting testimonies and evidence of what people called the New Underground Railroad, networks that helped black families escape the South after Reconstruction. Most people think that kind of organized resistance ended with the Civil War, but it didn't. It just became more hidden, more dangerous, and less documented. The journal contained testimonies collected in the 1960s from elderly people who had participated in or benefited from these networks. One entry, from a woman named Josephine Carter, described the system. They used railroad workers, church members, and sympathetic conductors. Families would be given special tickets with coded messages. You had to know which conductor to show it to, and you had to destroy the ticket after you arrived safely. It was dangerous for everyone involved. If you were caught helping, you could be killed. Rebecca and Marcus looked at each other. The ticket in Ruth's hands wasn't just proof of a journey. It was evidence of a vast, courageous network that had saved countless lives while operating in complete secrecy. Back in Detroit, Rebecca contacted historians who specialized in early 20th century railroad history. She needed to understand how the safe passage system had worked and who had been involved in organizing it. Her inquiry led her to Dr. Patricia Morrison at Wayne State University, whose research focused on black railroad workers and their role in community resistance. Patricia's eyes widened when Rebecca showed her the magnified image of Ruth's ticket. "The Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company," Patricia said, pointing to the text. "That's significant. They operated steamships and railroad connections between Detroit, Cleveland, and Buffalo. In 1904, they employed dozens of black porters, conductors, and dock workers, and some of those workers were definitely involved in helping families escape the South." Patricia pulled up records from her own research. "Look at this. A conductor named Abraham Wilson worked the Detroit route in 1904. I found references to him in several oral histories. He was known in the community as someone who could be trusted, someone who helped people. The notation on Ruth's ticket, 'Present to Conductor Wilson,' that has to be him." She showed Rebecca a photograph from 1906 showing railroad workers standing in front of a steam locomotive. Abraham Wilson stood in the center, a tall man with a dignified bearing and steady eyes. "He worked for the railroad for 35 years, Patricia explained. "After he retired, he was active in civil rights organizing. He died in 1941, but his grandson is still alive, living in Ann Arbor." 2 days later, Rebecca sat in the living room of Marcus Wilson, Abraham's 83-year-old grandson. The walls were covered with family photographs, including several of Abraham in his conductor's uniform. Marcus listened intently as Rebecca explained what she had found. "My grandfather never talked much about the details," Marcus said slowly. "But he told me once, when I was a teenager, that the most important work he ever did wasn't on the official schedule. He said there were families who needed help, who needed someone they could trust to get them safely from one place to another. He said he carried messages, helped arrange passages, and sometimes delivered tickets to families who were preparing to leave everything behind." Marcus went to a cabinet and pulled out a small metal box. Inside was a collection of his grandfather's personal papers. Among them was a small notebook, its pages yellowed and fragile. "This was his personal record," Marcus said, opening it carefully. "He kept it hidden his entire life. After he died, my grandmother gave it to my father, and my father gave it to me. I've never shown it to anyone outside the family." The notebook contained names, dates, and routes, a coded record of families Abraham had helped between 1902 and 1920. On a page dated October 1904, Rebecca saw an entry that made her throat tight. "Price family, Birmingham to Detroit. Mother, father, 3 children. Safe arrival confirmed. Ticket destroyed as instructed." Finding more information about Ruth Price herself required reaching out to her surviving family members. Through Clara Jenkins' relatives, Rebecca located Ruth's niece, Eleanor Price Hamilton, who lived in Southfield, a suburb of Detroit. Eleanor, 78 years old, had clear memories of her Aunt Ruth, who had lived until Eleanor was in her 30s. "Aunt Ruth was the most dignified woman I ever knew," Eleanor said, welcoming Rebecca into her home. "She became a teacher, spent her whole career educating black children in Detroit schools. She never married, never had children of her own, but she treated every student like they were her own family. She used to say that education was the one thing nobody could take away from you, no matter how hard they tried." Eleanor brought out a wooden chest that had belonged to Ruth. Inside were lesson plans, report cards, letters from former students, and a small leather diary. "She kept this diary from the time she was about 12 until she was in her 20s, Eleanor explained. "I read some of it after she died. She wrote about the journey from Alabama, about what her family had escaped." With Eleanor's permission, Rebecca carefully read through the diary's early entries. Ruth's handwriting started out childish and uncertain, but grew more confident over the years. An entry from 1910, when Ruth would have been 12, described the 1904 escape. "I remember being so scared on the train. Mama told me to hold the ticket close and not let anyone see it except the conductor," she pointed out. "She said it was our key to freedom, but also dangerous if the wrong person saw it. Papa took us to the photographer before we left Detroit Station because he wanted proof that we had made it, that we were safe, that we were free. He told me to hold the ticket in the picture so that someday someone would know how we got here and what it cost." Another entry from 1915 was even more revealing. "Papa told me tonight about Birmingham, about why we had to leave. He had asked for the wages he was owed, and they arrested him for it. He said in Alabama, asking for what you'd earned could get you killed or sent to a place where you'd work until you died. A man from the church helped him escape from jail. A network of people helped us get to Detroit, people who risked their lives so we could be free. Papa said we had a duty to remember, to document, to make sure the truth wasn't forgotten." Ruth had fulfilled that duty. She had kept the photographs safe her entire life, had preserved her father's story, and had passed it down through her family. The ticket she clutched in that 1904 portrait had been destroyed as instructed, but its image remained, proof of a journey, a network, and an act of courage that had saved a family. Rebecca's discovery of the Price family's story opened doors to understanding a much larger historical phenomenon. She collaborated with Marcus Williams in Birmingham and Patricia Morrison in Detroit to map out the extent of the new Underground Railroad that had operated in the early 20th century. Their research revealed a sophisticated network spanning multiple states. Church congregations in the North and South maintained quiet communications. Railroad workers, both black and white, passed information about safe routes and trustworthy contacts. Families who had successfully escaped often sent money back to help others make the journey. The system operated through coded language, trusted intermediaries, and careful documentation that was meant to be destroyed after use, which made Ruth's photograph all the more remarkable. Patricia found records of at least 30 other families who had arrived in Detroit between 1900 and 1910 under similar circumstances, helped by the same network that had assisted the Prices. Each family had fled specific threats: arrests on fabricated charges, forced labor contracts, racial violence, or economic exploitation that amounted to slavery in practice, if not in name. Marcus discovered documentation in Birmingham of the people who had helped families escape. Many were members of black churches who used their positions as domestic workers, deliverymen, or in other roles that allowed them mobility to carry messages and coordinate departures. Some were white allies, Quakers, and other religious groups who saw helping families escape as a moral imperative. And some were railroad workers like Abraham Wilson, who used their access to transportation to move people to safety. The risks were enormous. In the South, anyone caught helping a black person escape a labor contract or evade arrest could face criminal charges, violence, or death. In the North, those who assisted fugitives could be prosecuted under laws that technically still required the return of people fleeing legal obligations, even though slavery had been abolished. Yet the network persisted. Rebecca found evidence that it operated until at least 1920, helping thousands of families relocate to northern cities where they could build new lives with greater safety and opportunity. Detroit, with its growing automobile industry and established black community, was a primary destination. The photograph of Ruth Price, clutching her ticket with such fierce determination, became a symbol of this hidden history, a visual record of courage, resistance, and community solidarity that had been hiding in plain sight for over a century. Understanding the full weight of what Thomas Price had risked required Rebecca to dig deeper into what had happened in Birmingham in the days before the family's escape. She returned to Alabama and worked with Marcus Williams to piece together the timeline from court records, newspaper articles, and church documents. Thomas had been arrested on September 15, 1904, charged with breach of contract for demanding unpaid wages from his employer. The typical trajectory for such cases was swift and brutal: a quick trial before a sympathetic judge, a fine the accused couldn't pay, an immediate transfer to a company that would lease the prisoner's labor. Men sent to the labor camps rarely survived more than a few years. But Thomas never made it to trial. Marcus found a notation in the jail's logbook: Prisoner T, Price released on recognizance September 18, 1904. Case dismissed. No explanation. No record of who had posted bail or why the charges were dropped. Just a sudden, inexplicable release. A letter preserved in Second Baptist Church's archives in Birmingham, written by a reverend named Joseph Garrett, provided the answer. Garrett had written to a colleague in Detroit in October 1904. "We have assisted another family to safety. Brother Thomas was taken from jail through means I cannot detail in writing. The danger to all involved was considerable. The family departed within hours. I pray they have arrived safely in your city and found the assistance we arranged." The means Garrett couldn't detail became clearer through oral histories Marcus had collected. In several testimonies from the 1960s, elderly people described how the Birmingham network operated: sympathetic jailers who could be bribed or persuaded to look the other way, false paperwork that created confusion about a prisoner's status, and coordinated efforts to move people out of the city before authorities realized what had happened. Thomas had been given perhaps 24 hours warning that his release had been arranged and that he needed to leave Birmingham immediately with his family. Everything they owned had to be abandoned. Catherine had packed what they could carry: clothes, a few precious photographs, documents proving their marriage and their children's births. They had left their home, their community, everything familiar, with no guarantee they would reach safety. The train journey from Birmingham to Detroit took approximately 36 hours, with changes in Nashville and Cincinnati. For those hours, the family lived in constant fear of being stopped, questioned, or sent back. The ticket Ruth held was their protection, but also their greatest vulnerability. If the wrong person saw it, if they showed it to the wrong conductor, the entire plan could collapse. Thomas had documented that moment of terrible uncertainty in the photograph, showing his family safe in their new city, while his youngest daughter still clutched the evidence of how they had arrived. By early 2019, Rebecca had compiled her research into a comprehensive exhibition for the Detroit Historical Museum titled Hidden Passages: The New Underground Railroad in the Industrial Age. The centerpiece was the Price family photograph, displayed alongside the documentation Rebecca, Marcus, and Patricia had gathered. The exhibition drew immediate attention, Descendants of families who had made similar journeys contacted the museum, sharing their own stories and photographs. A pattern emerged. Many families had documented their arrivals in the North through formal portraits, marking the moment they reached safety and began new lives. Among the visitors was Eleanor Price Hamilton's daughter, Dr. Lisa Hamilton, who taught African American history at the University of Michigan. My great-great-aunt Ruth's photograph has given voice to thousands of people whose stories were never recorded, Lisa said at the exhibition's opening. These families weren't running from slavery. They were running from the systems that replaced slavery, the laws and practices designed to keep black people in bondage by different names. This photograph is evidence of their courage and of the networks that made survival possible. The photograph also inspired new research. Historians began systematically examining photographs from the early 1900s, looking for other instances of families documenting their escapes or preserving evidence of the assistance they received. Several more examples emerged, each adding detail to the understanding of how the network operated. Patricia Morrison expanded her research on railroad workers' involvement in the network, identifying at least 15 conductors and porters who had helped families travel safely between 1900 and 1925. Their descendants formed a collective to preserve and share these stories, ensuring that their ancestors' courage would be recognized. Marcus Williams worked with communities in Birmingham to document the people who had helped families escape, creating a memorial to their bravery. The memorial included the names of dozens of people, church members, workers, and ordinary citizens, who had risked everything to help others reach freedom. Ruth Price's diary, with her careful documentation of her family's journey and her father's explanations of why they had to flee, was published in an annotated edition. Her words provided a child's perspective on the terror and hope of escape, making the historical reality immediate and personal for contemporary readers. The photograph's impact extended beyond academic circles. It was featured in a PBS documentary about the Great Migration and its precursors, helping millions of people understand that the movement of black families from south to north wasn't just economic. It was often a matter of survival, requiring courage, planning, and the help of networks that operated in secret for decades. The exhibition at the Detroit Historical Museum remained on display for 18 months, and the Price family photograph traveled to museums in Birmingham, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. Each venue added context about local networks that had helped families escape oppression and build new lives in the early 20th century. For Rebecca, the project had transformed her understanding of how historical evidence survives and what it can reveal. A single photograph, carefully preserved through 4 generations, had opened a window into a hidden world of resistance, courage, and community solidarity. In June 2020, the Detroit Historical Society dedicated a permanent gallery to the stories of families who had come to the city seeking safety and opportunity between 1900 and 1930. The Price family photograph held the central position, Ruth's fierce young face and tightly clutched ticket serving as a reminder of what it cost to reach freedom. Eleanor Price Hamilton, 91 years old, attended the dedication ceremony. "My Aunt Ruth used to tell me that her father made her promise something when she was young," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her age. "He made her promise that if she ever had the chance to tell the truth about what happened, about what they escaped and who helped them, she should tell it. She kept that promise through her teaching, through preserving the photograph, through passing the story down. Now the truth she promised to tell is here for everyone to see." The gallery included interactive elements allowing visitors to trace the routes families had taken, read testimonies from people who had made the journey, and understand the network of helpers who had made escape possible. School groups from across Detroit visited regularly, learning about this hidden chapter of their city's history. Rebecca kept a copy of the Ruth Price photograph in her office, the little girl's determined expression, a constant reminder of why historical work mattered. Every object cataloged, every photograph examined, might contain another hidden truth waiting to be discovered and shared. Ruth Price had been 6 years old when she stood before the camera, clutching a ticket that represented her family's salvation and documenting a moment of extraordinary courage. She had lived another 76 years, teaching hundreds of students, preserving her family's story, and honoring her father's insistence that the truth must be remembered. The ticket itself had been destroyed in 1904, as Abraham Wilson's instructions required, but its image remained, pressed between a child's small hands, proof that, even in the darkest times, networks of courage and compassion worked in secret to help people reach safety. That truth, hidden for over a century in a family portrait, would now be remembered and honored for generations to come.